Delighted to introduce Mike Bedford, who will be chairing the session, and we also have Susan Bates and Wyatt Page here. And Mike is probably very well known to all of us in public health. He's a PhD student in our department, and he has a long-term interest in early childhood education centres and their effects. And I think we can really credit Mike with this wonderfully neutral title, Early Childhood Education in New Zealand, a hazard to child and teacher health, question mark, I should add. So I'm going to hand over to Mike, who's going to really chair the session.
Right, thanks, Michael. Yes, well, tēnā koutou katoa, thank you so much for coming, and also welcome to people who are joining us by webinar. Yes, the title, it's interesting. This is the first time I've ever done a presentation that has had two criticisms prior to being presented, both of which concern the title. And I want to point in this title to the question mark, because part of what we're presenting today is to raise the question. Let's have a look at what we've got and say, have we got situations here that can actually be hazardous? I have done a previous presentation that was titled So Much Potential for Good, So Much Potential for Harm. And that's how I see the sector. There is phenomenal potential for good, but these are vulnerable situations, vulnerable children, and actually vulnerable teachers. And so there can be good, there can be bad. But this is going to be a very tight session, so I'm going to move on fairly quickly. And aside from thanking people for coming, I also want to make a special little thanks to people who had been involved in my research during last year, some of whom may be watching the presentation, just to say thank you so much for the time you put in. Now, this session is not about my research. I'll touch on it slightly, but it was that indication of the huge effort that early childhood teachers make. 21 centres in my research cohort. And just one little thing was getting weekly reports from teachers and receiving them at 9 o'clock at night, Sunday afternoon. Sorry, Mike, another 12-hour day, but they're giving me this information, and it was voluntary. These are the lovely people who actually said, yes, we'll let you come and measure in our centres. I'd love to take you through a lot of beautiful pictures of the early childhood sector. I've worked in the sector for 25 years, probably visited something like 600 to 700 early childhood centres. And this is not a presentation by people who are trying to knock the sector. This is a presentation by people who are very concerned about what is happening to the sector that started so well. So, as I say, I would love to show you some of the beautiful pictures. We don't, unfortunately, have time, but I want to steal a moment just for a quick little illustration in the early childhood education context of potential, to get away from the idea of colours and numbers and children climbing on things and say it can be rich. This comes from a centre in Dunedin, Russell Ballantyne, his centre, early childhood on Stratford, and he had some boys who were digging a hole. And he's looking at this hole and he's thinking, it's getting to be a very big hole here. And so he went and had a chat with the boys and said, oh, good going, guys. Really great big hole. Do you think there could possibly be a hazard with this? Could somebody hurt themselves maybe? And the boys thought about it. Could someone fall in, dong someone with a spade or whatever? So Russell said, how about we do a site safety plan? So they developed a site safety plan. And the boys ran the site safety plan really well. After a while, a few days later, one of the boys came to Russell and said, Russell, we need a new foreman. Okay, why do you need a new foreman? Because I'm the foreman and I'm going on holiday and someone's got to be the foreman. And I'm thinking, yes, this is early child education. This is big muscle, digging holes, learning responsibility. This is children having fun while developing so much that is good for them, useful in the world. But I just want to point out that they couldn't have done that in the vast majority of full-day childcare centres because they wouldn't be able to dig the hole because most of the surfaces will be concrete or artificial grass, and there's nothing like enough space to allow that. But there is so much potential for good. What I want to do now is to hand over to Susan Bates. Susan is an early childhood teacher with experience in something over 50 centres. She's done a lot of work as a reliever, which gives an incredibly broad picture. She's also immersed herself in research, set up the Teachers Advocacy Group, now with about 1,600 members, and is a very strong supporter of individual teachers as well. And this is for us some vignettes of what can happen.
Kia ora. I want to say that yes, I am an early childhood teacher, and yes, I'm an advocate, and yes, I'm a researcher, because that's what early childhood teachers do, but I'm definitely not a presenter. This is way out of my comfort zone. So I'm trying to imagine this is like a mat time, but without singing, well, unless you want to sing. No singing. But I'm going to tell a couple of stories. So the first story is about a little girl I met in a centre that I was relieving in, and she didn't have any spoken English yet. She found a safe place with picture books and dolls, and she would speak in her own language, but she was finding it difficult to interact with others. Language is my thing. So I learned 6 very basic phrases for her. I got help with pronunciation from her dad, and I found a bridge for her, which she used. She came over it. She'd sit in my lap with the book, and we would swap words. The relationship became something more than just the conversations we were having. Whenever I went back to that centre, she let me know every time that I was one of her people. The second story is about a boy who has no language, no social skills at all. He didn't have the negotiating skills around play. And in my bag of tricks as a reliever, I have a circle game. It involves naming emotions. It's fun. Every child gets a chance to be the centre of attention in the middle. Every child interacts with another child. It's a game around empathy. And this boy wanted to play this game all the time because the rules for engagement had been taken care of for him. And other children saw this is how to play with this boy. I could tell a story, both of those stories, about dozens of children, because these are strategies that I've found around my interests. Teachers have hundreds of thousands of stories. This is what we do it for. We love working with small children. We love the difference it makes in their lives and in their families, and we love working with each other.
Thank you. So part of what we're looking at over this next 45 minutes or so is some of the things that actually get in the way of the quality. So each one of us, I think, would be passionate about getting really good outcomes for children. And so if you can look at it in that light, that it's really saying, what can we do to lift the quality in New Zealand? We have a statement that I have, not managed to get the clicking thing onto. We're just going to get the device in the right place. Yeah, that's probably better. Yeah, let's go to the down arrow. Okay, so we've got a statement coming from the Ministry of Education that we have among the highest standards for early childhood education in the world. And I would like to support that statement in 2 respects. One is our early childhood education curriculum guidelines to whariki. This has been called the jewel in the crown of early childhood education in New Zealand, and it is internationally recognised. And when I first saw that document, I said, this is the best government level document I have ever seen, and I would still say that. It's not only a brilliant educational model, but more than that, it's a brilliant human development model. So we have that. We also have pretty good standards for early childhood teacher training in terms of the requirements for teachers to be trained. That has slipped back a little bit, but it's still very, very good. We also have some people doing some stunning creative work in the sector. One Wellington organisation, Child Space, has done some brilliant work around design, as have many other people in the country. So I want to acknowledge those things too. Yes, we have some really good things, but I'd have to say that's about where it stops in terms of being anywhere near the best in the world. There are other things that we have that are definitely not the best in the world, and we have alarm bells ringing. This is just a quick look at some of the headlines in the past 3 years. And those things alone should suggest that something is going wrong. These are not statements from people trying to criticise the sector. These are statements and headlines generated by teachers and centre owners. It's an indication of stress. Child Forum has done some excellent work, a number of surveys, and this is a statement from 2017 survey. 27% of 900 respondents would not endorse their own centre's quality. Now, even if we halved that number, if we called it 13.5%, that's a big red flashing light. One of the problems you get when you do surveys like this, of course, is there's that selection bias that you're more likely to get responses from people who are concerned about things. But we don't actually have another mechanism at the moment. I would love to see the Ministry of Education surveying teachers themselves and looking to get a representative sample so they can hear back what are you really experiencing, but we don't have that happening at the moment. So it relies on surveys like Child Forum's, like Susan's work, where yes, you have to put up with the selection bias, but that does not mean the information is not valid. It's a teacher voice. A very alarming thing, the 2014 survey, 15% of teachers saying that they didn't have time to develop relationships with children. Relationships are essential to early child education and essential to care. Now, particularly when you are under 2 years old, or if you are, so let's say you're 1, and you're 8 to 10 hours a day in a centre and you are not connecting and getting the relationships with the people who are your teachers, people who are looking after you, and you are away from home. When you cry, you are left to cry. When you have a need, it is not understood because you don't have the relationship. That will create an anxiety problem. It has emotional socio-development consequences for children because at that stage, the thing they need most is security and connection. So to say that there isn't time to develop relationships is a serious thing. 12% reported consistent understaffing and breach of teacher-child regulations, ratio regulations. We also have indications of stress, of bullying, of injuries. Susan's going to talk a little bit more about that, so I won't say much more there. But we have another statement on quality coming from the Ministry. 98% of early child education services met or exceeded licensing standards. Another statement, our ECE services is in the world's top 3 for teacher qualifications and for the number of staff to children. Now, we're probably up there in terms of teacher qualifications, but ratios is another matter. So I took a quick look at this. Now, bear in mind, this is just a quick sample to see what I could find. To explain this graph quickly, you have age group columns coming down because different jurisdictions in the world use different ways to break up their thresholds. Some have 6 thresholds between birth and 5. We have 2. So we have, if you look at the line for New Zealand, 1 to 5 ratio for children under 2, and between 2 years and 5 years, 1 to 10. So this is 1 to 10 in full day centres. Sessional, you can do 1 to 15. But I'm just looking at full day here. I've coloured in green where these jurisdictions have a better standard than ours. And at the top, I've just mentioned 3 child advocacy or early child education advocacy organisations with their recommendations. Where it's shown in red, that's a standard worse than ours, and you can certainly find standards worse than ours. But I quickly found 10 jurisdictions definitely better than ours. You've got some like Greece where it's kind of like some's better, some's worse. But no, we're not in the top 3. Are we in the top 3rd maybe? I'm not sure. Comment on those ratios. What does 1 to 5 mean? Now this is a comment that was obvious to me when I considered what happens in a situation where you have 2 teachers and 10 children and 1 person is on nappy change and you're leaving 1 person with 9 and then something happens. And you've got to remember that this can be a mix of children maybe a few months old, some children start at weeks old, through to children who are nearly 2, all in the same environment, and you've got 1 person now trying to deal with 9 children. Quality is not about supervision, it's about relationship and connection and teaching and engagement with children's learning, engagement with their development. You need better than just control if you're going to call it quality. I want to touch on group size. Now, actually, back in that previous diagram, I should have mentioned it at the table, there was a column for countries that had regulations for group size. We don't. You can have any kind of group size you want, but generally, about half of those jurisdictions had control for group size, including some of the ones with worse ratios than ours. But this is just from Ontario. So for infants younger than 18 months, we're looking at a 3:10 ratio and maximum group size 10. This is a little bit more workable than, as I have heard of, 40 children under 2 in one group. I don't know that that can be quality. Another thing that I looked at was, there's another thing I want to mention around group size, because sometimes it's easy to miss this factor. Let's say you have 2 teachers and 2 teachers and 20 children. So that's a 1:10 ratio for children over 2. How many children are the teachers relating to? It's not 10. Each teacher is relating to 20 children in that group. Now let's double it. You've got 4 teachers and 40 children. How many children is each teacher trying to relate to? How many of those children does each teacher know? It's starting to get to be a real stretch. And that's where the children with behavioural difficulties, now in that group of 40, you're going to have a lot of children who have got developmental needs, they have behavioural issues, they have emotional issues, they may be coming from homes where they have had some damage from there. Now they're in a very crowded, very busy environment. You'll have children who are just trying to get away from it all, to get away from the noise, to find their own space. Children for whom English is a second language and they've just landed in this situation, they need help. How do you do that? With 4 teachers and 40 children. And if you have children who have that problem situation at home and they're in now a crowded, busy situation with not enough attention, you're starting to reinforce problems rather than help them. So a quick picture, but these are things to think about. I really want people to think about it. Temperatures. So going through temperature requirements internationally, not all countries have minimum temperatures because, of course, some of them are warm enough they don't need it. And you have blanket things like the European Parliament, minimum 18 degrees. But the only jurisdiction that I could find with our minimum temperature of 16 degrees was Tasmania. The only one apart from ourselves I could find anywhere in the world. We definitely seem to have the worst in the world minimum temperature standard. Now, that has implications in terms of viral survival for one, apart from comfort. But don't have a lot of time to go into detail there. What about our compliance? Remember there was that statement that we have 98% compliance with our regulations? Well, in the research last year, this is what I found. And bearing in mind, these are the lovely people who were helpful and let me put my temperature monitoring tags in. At the top, you have the percentage of time that the centres were above a threshold temperature or in a bracket. On the right-hand side, running down the right-hand side, the yellow is the percentage of time over 18 degrees. You've got between 16 and 18 in brown, and the blue temperature brackets are under 16 degrees, light blue under 14. Only 2 out of my 23 environments, 21 centres, were compliant with our worst in the world minimum temperature all of the time. And this is not because they don't want to be warm. This is because they're not getting the help with the technology, they're not getting the assistance through public health units, through the Ministry of Education, with heating systems that will work for them. So this isn't a criticism of the centres, this is a systemic problem that we need to address. But no, we don't have 98% compliance. Another serious issue is space. And I would say in some respects, this is perhaps the biggest one of all. It drives so many other things. Our minimum space inside is 2.5 square metres per child, free of fixtures and fittings. That's been downgraded from a requirement that said furniture and fittings, which will have shifted that down by about 10% in terms of actual available space. But let's see where we are compared with the rest of the world. So on the left-hand side, you can see indoor requirements. This is from OECD, and it's not complete because it's difficult sometimes to make direct comparisons. There are different ways of phrasing that space requirement, but this was their best shot. at getting a sensible measure. On the right-hand side, we have outdoor space. I don't think we're looking much like the best in the world. I've thought sometimes maybe this is because we're such a densely populated country, you know, with so many people packed into such a small space, but then I think our 4.5 million doesn't quite justify that. But anyway, let's say we were the best in the world. What does this actually look like when you put children into a space? Is it any good? I thought I'd use my house as an example. This is a modest 3 to 4 bedroom house, 125 square metres, average for 1960. And I've been having discussions about a possible 2 to 8 home-based care model where you'd have 2 adults and 8 children. And interestingly, I've had a reaction say, whoa, that could be quite a lot of children in a space. Here's what it looks like. 8 children, 2 teachers, and an activity space of 40 square metres. Now that is 1.8 times the Ministry of Education minimum. But what happens if we go to turning my house into a childcare centre, say a mixed age, under 2s, over 2s? You get something like this. So now we're talking about 30 children, 5 teachers, and you'll probably have a person in the office and probably a person in the kitchen. 37 people in my modest 1960 house. But what say you did all over 2s and you grabbed that terraced veranda space and covered that in, made it into a room so you could use it as indoor space? Well, now we might be looking at 40 children, 4 teachers, plus 2. And so that is an incredible level of crowding. That's the reality of it. What if you've got an 80-child centre? Is it more spacious? No, because you're operating to minimum standards. And that's what's happened increasingly in New Zealand, is minimum standards. So just double that. There's your 80-child centre. Is this good quality? Is it good for children? Are we compliant? No. In my survey, 9 out of 20 were below the minimum space 10% of the time, 6 out of 20 below 30% of the time. I'd like to go into the reasons for that. It has a lot to do with licensing and the way this is measured. But I can't spend much time on this. We definitely have evidence that crowding is a problem from international research in terms of infection transfer. And the other thing that I want to mention is outdoor space. 5 square metres per child. We go to my house, my quarter-acre section, my back garden would be licensable for 100 children as an outdoor space. No grass, because it's pummeled into nothing. It's all going to be artificial surfaces. But if you have a smaller centre, you're going to cut accordingly. So your 30-child centre is going to be 1/3 of 1/2 of a quarter-acre section for early child education. I think it's deserving that question mark. But now what I'd like to do is to hand over to Susan again. To Wyatt. Get our turns right. To Wyatt. So Wyatt is Associate Professor of Acoustics and Human Development. Sorry, Wyatt. Wyatt has also been a play centre parent and has a passion for this area as I do. He's done some excellent work in monitoring noise actually in the centres. So Wyatt, over to you.
Right, kia ora. So I'm just going to sort of put a bit of front end on how does noise affect in terms of human health and what are the key parameters, and then some results from some study work that we've done. It depends on the sound pressure level, in crude sense, how loud it is, how long we're exposed to it for, the nature of the sound, so the frequency content, what is it? And then the other critical thing that sits in there is what is our informational and emotional response and what's our current health status, because that dramatically changes from a day-to-day perspective how we might be affected by sound. In New Zealand, like most places in the world, there's sort of 2 parts to it. There's the occupational setting, which arguably is where the teachers sort of fit into it, and there's the environmental setting. And they've got some numbers and decibels associated with it. And the first thing, just looking at those, you'll see that on one side it says 85 dB, which is the occupational one, and the other side it says 55 dB during the daytime. In terms of energy level, and that's what matters, those are 1,000 times different. right? So every time you move 10 decibels on a scale, it's a factor of 10. So if you go from 55 to 65 to 85, it's 10 times 10 times 10. So from an energy perspective, which is what's important from a health impacts, they are very, very different. So why are they different? So on this side, it's all about hearing protection. That's what it's about. On the other side, it's about health protection, right? So they are very different categories and criteria that might apply with that. One thing I'll just put into it is there is no specific criteria for hearing protection for children. The default is to use the adult criteria, and I could make, I'm writing a review on that to say why that's not an appropriate criteria along the way. In terms of what we know on the environmental health side, is World Health Organization Europe, as a result of the European Noise Directive, a lot of good research has come out of this. So we know that if you happen to be a child, and this is school age children, young children on there, then, and you are near a noisy motorway or a similar urban centre, then you are going to have cognitive delay in children. Right? So that there's very, very good evidence around that. In New Zealand, the licensing criteria in early childhood centres with respect to noise is to take an all practical steps model. It's not to set hard numbers, and part of that was how do you go and enforce it? We have environmental health officers going around with sound level meters and measuring all these centres. So the aim was to come up with some criteria. A colleague of mine, Dr. Stuart McLaren, did, which was say, well, what is reasonable criteria? Something we could all measure. And it really comes around to, will it affect our ability to have normal communication, normal interaction and speech along the way? And similarly, we do not want it to cause undue stress or harm to children. And so this is part of the criteria. So obviously appropriate acoustic treatment, provision for quiet spaces, and then this, if you like, a qualitative criteria that most people can judge reasonably easily. In terms of numbers, what does that mean? If you're a child, normal speech, somewhere around 55 to 60 dB. If you're an adult, a little bit higher, 60 to 65 dB. So that's the criteria which that's sitting around into there. So in 2006, which seems an awful long time ago, and I'll put that into context, a fairly large study was done as part of a PhD looking at typical sound pressure levels in early childhood centres. So we had fixed sound level meters in the centres, and then we did dosimetry, which is basically means putting personal sound level meters, dosimeters on children and staff, allowing them to go about doing their normal stuff and measure the exposure. At the same time, we looked at the quality of the acoustics of these environments. Were they fit for purpose along the way? Because this is a short talk, we've got some short numbers. So what we did is we split it into 3 categories. This is using, of course, this is staff we're talking, so we're using the occupational criteria, this 85 dB 8-hour criteria that sits into there. And we split it into 3 categories: less than 50% dose, 50 to 100, and over 100 onto there. And we had a mixture of sessional and all day. If you go back then, it was much more common to have sessional centres than all day centres, where it would be exactly the opposite in the current environment. But if you have a look at the numbers on there, particularly down the bottom, which is the exceedance of the New Zealand occupational criteria, in the all-day centres, we had 11% of the participants, so 48 staff across the centres in there, which exceeded the occupational criteria. So they would be non-compliant to the regulations that we currently have in play. Less in the sessional centres, in part because, of course, they operate for a shorter duration of time, and time is one of the key elements of it. If you're there for a shorter time, less exposure, and therefore there's going to be less adverse health effects. One of the bottom line there is around peak exceedances. So the criteria for occupation was twofold. It's the continuous part, and then, if you like, the transient. So doors slamming, things clamming, those sorts of things, that's the focus for it. And again, you'll see in all-day centres, we've got 40% exceedance of that criteria. If you have a look at what the children, so this is children using adult criteria, which we've already said is probably not appropriate, but that's the criteria that we applied on there. If you have a look particularly at the all-day centres, 43% of those exceeded the adult criteria in terms of exposure on there. Less in the sessional centres, primarily due to duration more than anything else. It's not that they were doing different activities primarily, but they were there for a shorter duration along the way. So summarising our findings, in terms of the fixed setup, so where we're having levels typically averaging around 70 dB, and if you're a teacher who normally would talk at 60 to 65 dB and you're trying to hold a conversation, you basically have to shout. That's the only way we'll get right in someone's face in order to be able to communicate clearly. In terms of the staff, as I say, 11% primarily in the all-day centres exceeded the health and safety regulations, and around children, 25% in sessional and 43% in the all-day centres exceeded what we would use in adult criteria, which is already far too high. So if we put a more realistic criteria in, it's probably 100% of those children would be exceeding it in an all-day centre scenario. We also looked at the quality in terms of did it meet best guidelines for acoustics on there. 61% did not meet the requirements in terms of reverberation time, which is primarily to do with the acoustic treatments on those surfaces. And that's me.
Well, thank you so much, Wyatt. I wish we had more time on every single item here. There's so much more that we could say, both positive and negative. There are solutions to these things as well. So there's work that can be done that would fix a lot of this. But now what I'd like to do is hand over to Susan, and she's going to give us some results of some of the research that she has been doing completely out of her own time and energy. And I think it's really important work that sits alongside the work done by Child Forum. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. I feel like I'm in a marathon now. We have to rush through. This results from the survey have only just hatched. The feathers are still wet, so I'm going to do a very brief overview of some of the more obvious things that have come out of it. I do want to thank Tracy for letting me sleep on her couch to get it started, and I want to thank Tess for helping me with SurveyMonkey, and I want to thank Mike for, without him it wouldn't have got finished. So, and New Zealand Ethics for taking me through the ethics procedure and doing the approval. So we've already heard about group sizes, ratios and noise. 44% working at ministry minimums doesn't leave any space for people to have breaks or to be sick, or for children who need one-on-one attention, possibly most of the day. 42% of the respondents answered the stress and retention questions, and these were the ones who were very stressed, but also the ones who didn't think they had stress in their jobs. But that left 58% who didn't answer these questions. So were they not stressed? Well, when it comes to asking about the physical symptoms they were experiencing, 75% of the total were completely worn out often or several times during the previous 12 months, 75% suffering from sleeplessness, and 70% anxiety. So there's an issue here around people, whether they realise they're stressed, whether they realise they're on a road to burnout. This is an area for further research. So those who did answer the stress questions and said they were stressed, these are the factors that they identified. And by the way, that's managing children's behaviour, not managing their own behaviour, although that's probably a challenge as well. And we have our issues with bullying in the sector, as there are in just about every other sector. But I do want to say here that if you work in a shoe shop and you're being bullied, the shoes are not going to be affected. So this is a hazard for us with regard to infections. I had a year in South America and caught some pretty nasty bugs, but it was nothing like what children gave me in my first year of teaching. These are some of the factors, just 3 of them. There are a lot, but non-contact time is important because if work isn't getting done during the working day, it gets taken home and done in the weekends, it gets done after work. Staff rooms are important because we need our quiet spaces. We do quite intensely emotional and physical work. We need to give our bodies time to recover, and we need to take our head out of the game sometimes and then come back fresh. So we need breaks. And I thought it was interesting that 56% of the kindergarten teachers said that they only sometimes or don't get breaks because they actually have a collective agreement where it's clear what their breaks are supposed to be. There are a lot of injuries in early childhood. There are injuries that can happen over time, RSI, doing repetitive tasks. They can happen suddenly. The lower back, obviously 60% suffering from lower back issues. There's probably a number of things that can be done to fix this, but with shoulder, neck and lower back, there's a lot of research that indicates that these are symptoms of stress as well. These are the primary causes, so lifting and carrying, and especially with toddlers, it's not like carrying a box. You're carrying a load that can change its weight quite quickly. We do a lot of dressing and undressing of children. We put them in cots and into beds. We comfort them. We don't have adult furniture generally to do that. This is something that I've become quite hot about. We need to have a comfortable chair to comfort children. Bending, we do a lot of that. And injuries inflicted by children, they are often accidental, but more and more teachers are talking about wild children. They're being injured by children. So these are some of the things that can lead to injuries and what we do. Shifting heavy outdoor equipment, we're shifting bikes and stuff into storage units that aren't built for purpose, shifting heavy boxes, shifting climbing equipment. So this is an area that has had no research done on it, pregnancy in early childhood. We have no training on how we protect ourselves or our unborn babies, and given the number of infections that we're exposed to, the hard physical work that we do, this is definitely an area that needs further research. And sick leave, most get 5 days. 43% of teachers who are working when they're ill are contributing to health problems later on. There's lots of research around this. If we're going back to work too early or not taking the time off we need, it goes right out to quite severe heart issues. And the expectation that you work when sick, it's there. But teachers put a lot of pressure on themselves too. They don't want to let the team down. They know that there's not enough staff, so they go in. So I'll just give you a minute to read these because I've experienced all of these situations. But because I'm mostly a reliever, I haven't experienced these 9 hours a day, 5 days a week for months or years. This is the kind of thing that takes away that joy that I talked about in the beginning. This is what teachers want. Kia ora.
Thanks, Susan. I think it's really sobering when you look at that as a contrast to the kind of delight that it should be. I want to try and get us back to the situations where being an early childhood teacher is a pleasure, and where, for example, if you're doing nappy change, my colleague in public health, Kerry Sutherland, she trained as an early childhood teacher, worked a lot with under 2. She had someone to say, "Oh, I'm supposed to spend a lot of your time changing nappies, don't you?" And she said, "Yeah, and it's an incredibly special time with a child. That's the one-on-one, it's not that there isn't other one-on-one, but in that particular situation, it's described as a date with a child, this is where it's just us. It's intimate, and it needs to be quality time. But I have observed assembly line nappy change, seen a child picked up, put on the floor, turn around, next one. This is not necessarily because we have a badly behaved early childhood teacher. We're talking about a situation where maybe you are just in pain because the ergonomics are so poor and you have been given this to do all day and you are worn out and you're at the end of yourself. So what happens to teachers affects children. We've got to do better with the ergonomics and, of course, the ratios. Okay, I want to touch on 2 things just in the last 5 minutes. Down arrow. One of them is attachment. Now, I had a conversation with Michael at the end of last year where, Michael, you asked me what did I think was the most important issue in the early childhood sector. And I think perhaps this was thinking epidemiologically. And I said infant and toddler mental health. Outside my PhD research, but one of the things that I have said to people is if you haven't visited an early childhood centre and left, sorry, it's got me, left fighting back the tears, you don't know what's going on. And some of that is when you get indiscriminate attachment. Sorry, I'm going to seal myself. this happens, that's a child who's just desperate for somebody. They're not getting the attention they need. You walk in, you make eye contact, you're the person on the spot. And so naturally I can respond, but I'm going to walk out that door maybe 5 minutes later. What have I done? That's hard. But it's what's happening when children are not getting their attachment needs met. But if you think of it in the positive, if you have children who are secure in their attachments, they're confident, this is the Te Whariki goal of confident, competent learners. That will happen when children's emotional needs are met. Wellbeing and belonging are basic to early childhood education, and they are 2 strands out of 5 in the curriculum. When you interrupt that with a lack of attachment, now you're looking at things like this: preoccupation with needs provision. And if you go past that, you may get your shut down child who's given up. And if you have, setting into your brain wiring at a very early age, a lack of attachment, an inability to connect with other people, a lack of expectation to connect with other people, how does that manifest in teenage years? Where does this lead to? What's the trajectory? Okay, that's one issue. The other one I want to talk about is in Education Review Office reports, they have a way of rating the centres as very well placed, needs development, and not well placed. Well placed is talked about in terms of the ability to provide quality education and care. But I want to talk about another aspect of well placed or not. And I just want to say that I'm not trying to hit at any individual organisation in this country. This is part of the general scene. So I haven't named the ownership of these centres, but one of them you'll see isn't actually there because it was built after the Google Earth photo was taken, but I can give you the location. Is there anything in the interests of children that would put a 75 centre and 100 child centre in those locations? I can't imagine it. The reason for putting centres there is commuter traffic and possibly the economics of setting up a centre on that piece of ground. But there's nothing in it for the children. So I'm sorry to the people who own these centres, but I'll put a direct challenge and say why? Why have we got centres and locations like this sandwiched between 2 major roads, a railway line in the middle of a commercial area with no natural environment at all? And these will be operating almost certainly to minimum space. I've been into the 75 centre, child centre, not into the other one. Okay, another one to think about. The play area that you're looking at is the under 2s area. In an under 2s area, every surface is a contact surface. These children are playing within 6 metres of up to 1,000 vehicle an hour traffic, braking and accelerating on a corner, and where that photo is taken from is the direction of the prevailing wind. So the wind is towards that building. We know enough about emissions and particulates to be concerned about this, but we have a gap in our public health attention on these things. I know that in Auckland there's been an attempt to try and give attention to this kind of problem, and the people who are concerned about it in public health units have been effectively told to back off by the Ministry of Health. Okay, challenge to the Ministry of Health. This is a priority area. We do need to be dealing with it. I have been told directly from the Ministry it's not a priority. So I don't want to be subtle about this anymore. I've been in the sector for 25 years and I'm tired of seeing the early childhood sector sidelined for health. We really need to give attention to it at government level, cross-government, to connect the ministries of health and education and have that work done together as a priority. Okay. If you would like to ask questions after the session, you can email us with questions for the areas that we've talked about. And finally, I just want to give a quick thanks to support from my colleagues here for the aspects that relate to my research with Hekainga Oranga and the funding for my own research that came from brands. And also, again, just a big thank you to Wyatt for the work he's done, and especially to Susan for the colossal amount of work that she has done. So now we're into question time, and there is a roving mic, so if you've got a question, then do just wait for the microphone. And also, I don't know if we have questions coming from people on the webinar, but I understand they are able to send a question in as well. Oh, actually, before we proceed to a question, I'm going to mention one more thing, and I'm not quite sure. Oh, here we go. I'm just going to go back up to there. You'll see at the top there, there is just established a LinkedIn network that is the Early Child Education Health Research Network. I'm looking at this actually as preliminary to perhaps down the track establishing a research association specifically for this area of work. But please pop on LinkedIn, go to the Early Childhood Education Health Research Network. At the moment it has one member, myself, because I've just set it up. So don't be surprised if you don't find other people there yet. Please be the other people, please come in if you have any interest in getting involved in the research and talking to one another. Okay, thank you both for your questions.
Thanks very much for a lovely presentation. So there's a very clear problem here. What's the first step, or what's the first thing we need to do to get a change in early childhood education?
Do you want to comment, or?
There's so many problems. We need to look at the regulations, what they're saying, what they're doing. I think it's pretty clear that the minimum regulations are just too low.
Yes, I'd certainly back that. That would be the first thing that I would want to address, is that we have to look at regulations that are designed for the welfare of children. And just to give a quick example, when I mentioned the outdoor space of 5 square metres per child, I've spent about 5 years doing outdoor area design for early childhood centres. And I can tell you that most play centres and kindergartens, which are designed for children as opposed to childcare, are between 15 and 25 square metres per child. So that's between 3 and 5 times the minimum space. That's what you get when you design for children. So that's the answer, is all of these things have to focus on children more than they are on childcare and economics, without ignoring the childcare and economics. That has to be part of the picture. Questions?
Time for lunch.
Oh, thanks, Mike. I just had a quick question. What is the role of local authorities in this regard? For example, have they got scope for doing bylaws or something?
Generally, the role of local authorities is in relation to resource consent. And thank you so much for mentioning that, because that is also a major area of work that is needed. Now, I know that in the Wellington area, I've just heard that public health is starting to engage with the councils on resource consent conditions, or at least this is rumour that has reached my ears. I haven't had a chance to talk to them about it yet, just found out a few days ago. But one of the problems with resource consents, I talked to one developer of centres in the Wellington region. He said he would no longer try to develop a centre in a residential area because of resource consent requirements. I have come across in the Hutt Valley a centre being required to put a sound attenuation wall around the edge of a property on a corner, not to protect children from noise from the traffic, but protect the traffic from the noise from the children. Being told that they can't have any wooden decking because it's too noisy. So the role of the local authorities is to respect that statement that children are not just citizens of the future, they're citizens now, to treat them as citizens now, and to also encourage and try to facilitate the development of centres close to green spaces, in green spaces, to see what we can do to set land aside that would encourage development of centres in good locations. That would be my best comment there.
Thank you to all the speakers. I just had a question really about the ownership structure of ECEs. Who is it? We get the impression sometimes that it's become more corporate and it's more of a business model. Is that the case? I mean, how does ownership? how is it organised in New Zealand, and is that changed? Are the new pressures on these environments as a result of the ownership model?
Yes, I think the ownership is a very important aspect. So all early childhood centres in New Zealand are either community owned or privately owned now. So there's nothing that is government run. Kindergartens once upon a time were, but they are not any longer under Ministry of Education. Clearly the growth area is in private and corporately owned centres, and the size of the corporates are growing as well. Now, I want to be careful in that to say that doesn't have to be a bad thing. That could be a good thing. But it is increasingly a business model. And so we have centres owned by publicly listed companies. So you're paying shareholders. So this is a situation that is very different from the kindergarten model that existed before the mid-90s and the predominance of community-owned, community creches and that kind of environment. So yes, definitely a shift towards a commercial model.
I don't have a question, I have a statement that unfortunately I didn't find any of that surprising, which is really, really sad. I used to own centres way back, and they were small houses, converted houses, but the relationship with and there are only 30 children over twos, but those huge corporations with 100, 150 is just another kettle of fish, and it's like, where do we start, really? But we have to stop it, because I've worked in centres where children just don't want to be there. They're there 10 hours a day and they don't want to be there. And their parents are giving instructions, don't put them to sleep, otherwise they'll be still awake at 7 o'clock at night. And yet when my kids were little, it was 3 hours a day at play centre, and you are pulling them away because they just never wanted to go because of their friends. So it's really sad actually what's happened. And there are so many stressed children and so many stressed teachers, and teachers are getting hurt.
Yeah, it's
really
true.
bad. I was spat at one of those centres that you put up that I won't return to. But yeah, children are just,
I think
it's a different world.
It's worth adding to this that I only graduated in 2011. I came to early childhood after spending a year in South America and seeing refugee families and small children. There's real poverty there, and I realised I had a rapport with children. It was natural, and the language barrier didn't make a difference. But a good chunk of the people that I graduated with in 2011 have left ECE, and they have no intention of coming back.
Just around salads, as I said, I'm a play-centred dad, and I've got 2 11-year-old twins, so I went through with twins, and I have to say I was on the delightful end of the scale. I found it, from a parent's perspective, wonderful opportunity to see different teaching, learning styles, because the key thing is it's parent-driven. You do ECE training as part of that, and that's really the joy scene, and that's where Mike was pointing at. To me, that's where it should be. You're having to pull the kids away, and parents. Yes, you end the session tired, but you end it very rewarded, and it's a fantastic environment. And and the key thing was, of course, is that relationship. The numbers were small, so I had a relationship with every child. There were sessions on there, and lots of one-to-one time. And you can't do that when you're crammed in. And a lot of the acoustics issues that I'm talking about are around, even with the best acoustics, if you don't have the space, kids make noise. That's part of the play into the end. You can manage to a certain extent, but if you're wanting to reduce noise exposure and therefore stress for staff, and that you need more space, it's the only way. Distance is the opportunity to reduce that.
Like my colleague next to me, I don't have a question. I do have a sort of a conundrum, I guess, for you, and that's we're talking about services and what's happening within services, but I rather suspect that some of the underlying problems are happening more at the institutional arrangements and it's happening actually back in government, because some of the activity or inactivity, if you like, of the ministry really is because, like, the places they can be short-staffed or they have high turnover of staff, and you don't have the continuity of people and deep understanding of the regulations, and so you get national inconsistency happening with licensing. So there's quite a fundamental problem that sits outside of, the operational level too, which I don't know how we resolve, but I just wanted to say that. So.
That's why I came to Wellington, so that I could make myself known to people in the ministry and the Education Council and other places, and it's been useful.
I'll just make a comment on that as well, which is workforce development. So this is necessary, it seems crazy in the sense to say that it should be for the Ministry of Education, but yes, I think there is a reflection there, although some really, talk to some really good people from the ministry. There are people who understand the sector very well and there are people who don't. But in the mid-90s, I established the early childhood health program for the Wellington region. And one of the principles of that program was that you couldn't do health and early childhood education unless you understood early childhood education, in which case you had to understand children. So anybody working in that public health program went through training in relation to the sector and in terms of early childhood education to pull together the health and education understanding. To me, that was vital. And it's one of the reasons that we need a much greater level of connection across government departments, and also training programs within government agencies across the country. So I would love to be able to work with public health units all around the country, but there's no funding for this. There's no program for this. It's perfectly possible to do it, to provide information into the Education Review Office, for example. I've done this in the past, would love to do it again. And so it's not just a case of teacher training, it's a case of government agency training. If that perhaps answers something of that conundrum, I think that's what we need, is training within government agencies, upskilling, keeping up to date, and also addressing concerns in a constructive way, so that if Child Forum, for example, put out alarming information, I'm going to put something very bluntly here, we have to stop having a culture of denial. That's what I think we have, is a culture of denial. One of the criticisms that I had of my title was that perhaps it didn't consider enough the effect of that title on parents. I think we have something serious enough that parents need to know that all is not well. It's not good enough any longer to keep telling parents everything is fine out there, we've got everything under control, the regulations are being complied with and they're good regulations. This is not the case. We have to be honest, rip the covers off and deal with this. And so one thing I would like to see from the Ministry of Education is to work with people like Child Forum, to work with Susan's research, and start saying we're on the same side, let's address these problems.
Oh, Mike, I just had another question, which follows on from that last point that you made. Do you know the views of parents and whānau on some of these issues? Has there been any research to hear their views? And because that's an important bit, but you also will need to get the parents and whānau and communities on board if we want to change regulations or get policy change. We'll need that wider buy-in from the community to agitate for change.
Yes.
Yeah, that's exactly why I started the Teachers Advocacy Group. It was to include parents and whānau. I did a little research project a couple of years ago where I interviewed 11 parents. It was extremely difficult to find 11 parents to interview. But once I found that they had a perception of what early childhood was quite different from the reality. I'd be happy to pass that on to you, so please have a look at my email address.
Thank you.
Well, I'm sure you all agree it's been a really helpful session, and I think we can almost remove the question mark from the title, A Hazard to Child and Teacher Health. And I think, like many people here, I guess we often have a sort of apple pie motherhood view about early childhood education, that it's been a great success story. It's promoted or improved services for encouraging child development, maybe also supported women entering the workforce and pay equity. And I think it is really interesting to hear a counter view, and I think a very convincing counter view, both in terms of evidence and I think obviously quite a strong emotional element to all of this. And in some ways it reminds me, we often think, the home has been the most unregulated environment for children, but it also appears that ECE is also another environment where regulation has really let us down. So I think a huge thank you to Mike, Susan and Wyatt for that session.
Thank you. See you again.
That's great. And I can see there's so much depth to all the work you're doing. And great stuff, Mike.